Howdy, howdy, y'all. Welcome back to Some Antics. Happy Tuesday. How's everyone doing? Today I am joined by Eric Bailey. Eric, hello. Welcome to the stream.
Hey, how's it going? Thanks for having me, Ben.
I'm so stoked to have you on. For folks who haven't gotten a chance to see you and your work yet, would you care to give yourself an introduction? Kind of let folks know who you are?
Sure. I am loud on the internet, but by day I work at a company called Ad Hoc, and I work on design systems there, which is basically a way to codify user interface components for designers and developers to help promote consistency and accessibility. Um, when I am not at work, I like to write and read a lot about inclusive design and accessibility. I also help maintain the A11Y project, which is a open source website to try to help people learn about digital accessibility. Yeah, I live in the northern United States. My pronouns are he, him, and just generally happy to be here.
So thrilled to have you on. I'm getting a link for the A11Y project into the chat right now. This is a lovely resource. And by the way, I love the work that Tatiana did on the redesign. I know it's been out for a while, but they did such a good job.
Yeah, Tatiana's, we were very fortunate to have her do this work. And one of the goals for it was to kind of demonstrate that accessible design can be beautiful as well as, exciting and dynamic. And in my opinion, she knocked it out of the park.
Absolutely. All right. Yeah, so today the topic at hand is high contrast mode. I put out a tweet a couple weeks ago because I like just I guess to lay the groundwork for my own story here. I uh I've been doing web dev for a couple of years professionally and specifically accessibility work for a couple of years now. And just a couple weeks ago, I got my first like story that had to deal with like high contrast mode, and I realized I was at a complete loss for how to get started. It was like a huge gap in my knowledge. So I put a tweet out kind of as a result of this, like, hey, does anyone know a thing or two about high contrast mode that would like to teach me? And you reacted like within minutes. Which kudos. So let's talk about that. What is high contrast mode?
Yeah, I totally do not have a watchword on Twitter for this. It just happened to be happenstance. So high contrast mode is a form of assistive technology, the same way a screen reader is, the same way voice control software is, in that it affects all content on a device, including a browser and whatever the content the browser currently happens to be showing. And it is a way for the trick is a little bit in the name where it grants the ability to adjust the colors to have a higher contrast ratio. So it is easier for the person using the device to perceive. It's also sort of a very personal form of assistive technology. I think all forms of assistive technology are personal, but this one allows somebody to use a high degree of customization of these color values to get what they want. In addition, it typically represents kind of the last kind of thing you can do for a lot of circumstances where your vision is impaired before you go blind. So it's a very vital piece of assistive technology, and it's a little bit of a hidden secret on the web platform in particular. So hopefully we can shed some light on it.
Yeah. Yeah, so I'm thrilled to do that. So you mentioned that it was people are picking like higher contrast colors. Is it always higher contrast colors?
That's a really I learned this recently myself. So the name is a bit of a trick because one of the cool things about putting something out there that is very customizable is people will make it work for whatever their needs are. And part of that is some people actually deliberately use low contrast themes. They create muted color tones. And this is really interesting because for them, it's not bumping the contrast until it's perceivable. It's being used to prevent things like tension headaches or migraines because the overall effect is a lot calmer. So that's really cool. I think it's a really kind of powerful feature and a kind of an unintended consequence of kind of when Microsoft first rolled out this feature.
Mhm.
And then I think that's also a little bit of a segue into why it's now called force colors and not high contrast mode.
Sure. Um, yeah, and from what little I know of this, it seems currently to be mainly a Windows only thing for now, right?
Yeah, it's a bit of a mess to be honest. I think we might get into that into a little bit, but the version that I'm talking about, which is completely covering the entire operating system, as well as being able to customize colors, is currently Windows only. And we'll
Gotcha.
put a little pin in that because we'll come back to it, I think.
Good deal. Um, yeah, so in that case then, how do we get started? Like it for anyone actually let me start sharing my here. So anyone looking at my screen can see like I'm operating on a Mac right now. So I don't natively have really access to high contrast mode to be able to test and validate for myself. So in that case, how might I get started?
Yeah, there's a few ways. So one way is, and I'll kind of take you up, I'll build you up to kind of my preferred approach. So first, you can go out and get a Windows device if you have the money. Not all of us have the money, so that's, take it or leave it. It's something you can do. You can also emulate Windows using Microsoft puts out free virtual machines, and you can use a service like VirtualBox to test on your Mac. I don't like using that because it's very system intensive and it tends to slow everything down. It also takes a lot of storage space to have a VM
Mm,
on your Mac, and node modules are inescapable. So it's like you're going to be competing if you do any kind of dev work. Um, you can also emulate the force color mode media query using Microsoft Edge just rolled out this ability, as well as the browser Polypane, which I like to use for my web development work because it lets me look at the design in both a mobile and desktop context at the same time. The wrinkle with uh, Edge and Polypane is that they only show force color light mode or force color dark mode, and they don't allow you to alter the system colors that map to a high contrast mode theme. And that's important because one of the things that I think is important to do is change your themes periodically just to not get comfortable with force color mode, high contrast mode looking just one way. It can look potentially infinite different kinds of ways, which leads me to my preferred solution, which is Assistive Labs, which is a Windows emulation service that works in your browser. It is made, I believe, by a gentleman called Weston Thayer. And Assistive Labs is purpose built for assistive technology testing, and it runs a VM in the browser. So it's sort of like watching Netflix in a browser tab. Only instead of watching Netflix, you're using a Windows OS. So here on the screen right now, we have we have the dashboard for Assistive Labs. And there's drop-down toggles for picking an assistive technology version, the version of that assistive technology, the browser, and the browser version. There's also some niceties for mapping caps lock to different assistive technology hotkeys. And then it also has an assistive tunnel feature. And this is a lot like ngrok if you've ever used it. If you haven't used it, it's a way to share basically an IP address. So you can make your edits on your Windows laptop. You can look at it on your Windows emulated OS, and the changes you make there will kind of propagate. And I use that in my work a lot because while I do have a Windows device, a browser tab is way more convenient, and I can't be bothered a lot of the time to reach across the table.
absolutely. Right. And yeah, so if you pop open the assistive technology drop down, I noticed that there's a Windows high contrast option. probably the one to go with, right?
Yeah, let's do it.
Awesome. And then there's just 21H1. Looks like just Edge and just 99. Okay, I don't really have a whole lot in the way of choices there, it turns out.
Yeah, I mean the good news is the high contrast mode toggle is relatively static. It hasn't done a lot of changing, so you don't really have to worry super too much about browser versions. Again, a little caveat there, but you know, Edge is totally latest version of Edge is totally fine. Latest version of Windows is totally fine.
Since reason window over here that's like there we go. Okay. Sorry. Streaming setups are wonky. Okay, so and then are we I guess we're not tunneling either. And we
Uh,
probably don't need to remap any keys or anything like that because we're not doing any anything with like screen reader today, I don't think. So
yeah,
go ahead and just start testing.
let's go for it.
Adrian Engine wants to know. So it is like I think Adrian's referring to Assistive Labs here. So it is like a browser stack for accessibility testing.
Yeah, that's a really good way to put it. Um, I have mixed thoughts about browser stack, so I will kind of leave it at that. But this is very purpose built and dedicated, and as you can see, it boots up really quickly.
Yeah, that was really fast. Do I need it to see text and images, or can I go ahead and block that?
Um, you can, yeah, you can block it. That's just like a shared clipboard between Mac and the VM.
Oh, that's pretty cool. All right, and then we'll shift option backtick. Looks like. All right, so all right, and then so this is emulating in Windows. This is like I've gone into my like preferences here, and actually it's not emulating, is it? It's like this is actually a VM.
This is the real deal. It's a real fake copy of Windows.
All right. Um, and if I turn this on, everything updates. All my colors have updated. It seems to have gone with a dark theme, but there's other themes built into Windows as well. Uh,
Yep.
all
Yeah,
right.
it ships with four themes: high contrast, one, two, white and black.
Mhm.
And this kind of gets into how in a force colored context, anything can be any color. So that's kind of speaks to why I prefer to kind of change them up just because of this very reason. And if you can't see the screen, one thing I do want to point out is there are one, two, three, four, five, six kind of chunks of content, and each one has a corresponding color. And those colors map to the operating system. For example, the selected text background color and foreground color. Right now, we're on the high contrast preference tab in the settings on Windows OS, and it's using those colors. It's using yellow for the regular static inert text of like select a colored rectangle to customize, blah, blah, blah. So this is really deep support that ties into how the operating system is built. And I think that's pretty cool.
Absolutely. Yeah, and everything has changed as a result of this. Like if I open up the start menu, uh, it might not open anything. We'll see. But like everything is following these colors that have been selected by the given theme. If I pick a different theme, we get some different colors popping up. Um, I think there's I think there's a way to like create your own theme, or I guess you could just go in and change colors in
Yep,
here.
yep.
Very neat.
So yeah, for each one of these little swatch palettes, you can click on it and it'll bring up a color picker and you can tweak stuff until it looks nice for you. Again, both these colors can be anything and they don't necessarily have to be high contrast. So, again, just something to keep in mind. The other thing that like I kind of want to stress here is this might look like the ugliest thing you've ever seen, but that's okay.
Mhm.
um, I'm a designer by trade, so I'm kind of used to people with very strong opinions about how stuff should look. But I do want to point out that this is usable for somebody, and it
Hmm.
may not be what you aesthetically consider to be good looking, but it's functional. And that's the really important bit here. So, like, to be comfortable with that kind of change with your product is a pretty like brave, in my opinion, position to take, because it's all about letting go of control to let your end users have agency. And a lot of assistive technology is built on that kind of philosophy. And I think Force Colors mode really exemplifies it.
Right. Absolutely. So I would like to see some sites with this. So I think I need to just go ahead and hit apply. Oh, I see. The Antics theme, perhaps. Um, and I guess it's already applied.
Mhm.
And I see I've got like Edge here, so I could go to any website. Heck, you know what? I'll put Ali Project in. I
Oh
love
yeah.
my project.
Uh-oh.
But yeah,
There we go.
we can see how this and I've actually got the two tabs up so we can do some comparison here, but we can see how like there's clearly been some changes going on here.
Mhm.
There you know it's based on the same design, but a lot of the colors have been replaced. I think it looks like backgrounds have been changed and stuff like that. What kinds of things can change as a result of forced colors mode?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So the the way it works under the hood, when you have like when you're using like Windows software that isn't web content, you use kind of specific chunks of like OS user UI kind of code that says like I'm a switch toggle, I'm a button, I'm text that describes something. And the same way that that's built into the operating system, it's also built into the browser. So force color mode, Windows high contrast mode, maps to semantic HTML, which is very cool if you're in the accessibility space because you're already kind of doing this. So in the theme, button foreground color and background color works for operating system buttons. So like the OK on a save confirm dialog. It also maps to the button element itself.
Hmm.
Headings will inherit text, links will inherit like anchor links,
Yeah,
disable. Oh, yeah, sorry.
yeah, like just as a concrete example, like hyperlinks are defined as yellow here, and when I go to get my tabs and windows straight, when I go here, like this hyperlink right here is yellow.
Yep. There's also kind of an, in my opinion, unintended side effect of this too, where we use different link colors on the accessibility project with a lot of restraint. But here it makes the blanket rule that all links are now yellow, provided
Hmm.
they've been semantically coded. And that helps to kind of enforce visual consistency as well. And that's very helpful if you're in a very like a highly low vision kind of context, because you don't have to do extra guesswork to be like, is this or not? It doesn't have an
Hmm.
underline, so I don't know. It's just like, this is yellow, it's a link, end of discussion.
Yeah. And I'll just to have another site up. Apologies for just suddenly putting you under the bus. That's not cool of me,
No,
but I'll put my own site under the wire, as it were. So for folks who haven't seen what my site looks like when you don't have Force Colors mode on, um, or you haven't overridden it with custom user style sheets, this is what my site looks like. There's a lot of like purple over here. I've got some card treatment, stuff like that. Um, and when I come back here, a lot of that stuff is gone. Um,
yeah. So I love your site design, by the way.
Thank you.
It's just aesthetically, chef's kiss. But a thing I'd like to point out here. So force colors mode does not care about your aesthetic sensibilities, remember? So one
Mhm.
thing it does that is very worth pointing out is it will throw out decorative backgrounds. So your site in non-force colored mode has that lovely purple um, vector effect. I don't know the name for it. But here in force colors mode, it has decided the ratio between text and the background is the important thing here because that's the most legible, and consequently it throws it out. And that's
Mhm.
fine.
Oh yeah.
You're still communicating the branding of your site and your personality through your writing, through your font choices, through your overall layout. Like, in my opinion, that's the strength of like somebody who is good at their craft, which is you don't rely on one single kind of aesthetic hook to communicate what you're trying to get across.
Awesome. Um, yeah, and so in that case, then, and maybe my website is a bit of a poor choice because I've gone in and like changed things. Like I had to go in and add the borders to like make the hit area a little clearer. But um, yeah, in general, I guess. Wow, I need to take a step back. Where would you like to take this? What now that we've kind of seen how high contrast mode can impact the site and change the appearance, where do you want to go from here?
Yeah. When we were planning this, you'd floated looking at Wikipedia potentially.
Okay.
And I think maybe we can suss out maybe a bug with Wikipedia and then um, talk about kind of the options that we have. So the what I'm thinking is like support is complicated, so this might be an easier way to talk about it.
Hmm. All right. Already I noticed that there is a big chunky border around this website.
Yeah, that's
Very fun.
interesting.
Very fun. And then if I pull up article like the one on web accessibility here, um, one thing
Not
I
bad.
noticed is that the Wikipedia logo doesn't actually show the word Wikipedia in
Hmm.
this particular mode.
Yep.
Um,
Yep. And if there's, I think if also if there's one takeaway you get from this session, is like, I take a pretty forgiving approach here, where like force colored mode is very buried, very obscure. You usually have to be an accessibility wonk to even know it exists, much less how it works. So now that you kind of know it's a thing, like just take a look at kind of the stuff you work on and see if there's any like egregious gaps in support, because it's relatively straightforward to tweak this stuff. It's more just learning that it exists in the first place is kind of, in my opinion, like the tricky bit.
Absolutely. I want to see. I think the assistive technology article has like um images and stuff like that. Uh, so images can come through. That makes sense, but not always, right?
Yep, if it's a background image, which sometimes people use like when they have a CMS and they don't know, sorry, a content management system, and they don't know the size of the image a user may import. So that'll get thrown away. You can disable force color mode effects on stuff. So there is a specific kind of declaration you can have, and that's a circumstance where you might want to use that. So you say basically you tell the browser and the operating system, please ignore this and retain its treatment. Again, you want to use that for content where there's an intentional decision, and you don't want to use it for aesthetics. So like, what is good? Showing a picture that communicates something. So like an avatar or an uploaded photo of something in a gallery. What is bad is I really like the color pink, so I think that should be present in our branding.
Makes sense. Right. And then so we we do have the power within our own sites to be able to tweak and curate force colors mode. Like, how would we go about doing that? Like, what does that actually look like in practice?
Sure. So it's a visual thing, so you can use CSS. Surprise. There are two media queries that can target both Windows high contrast mode and forced contrast mode. And I'm going to paste a link in the chat for a Smashing Magazine article I wrote about this, because I think it'll be
Yes.
helpful to have a talking point about it. You think I would have bookmarked this ahead of time? Here we go.
Uh,
Zoom
there
chat.
we
Yep.
go. So pop that in the Twitch chat, and then pull it up here.
What a good Twitch host. That would have never occurred to me.
It's a whole thing. You what I've really enjoyed is guesting on other people's streams and then just like preempting the whole like having the host share the thing, and I'm just like, "Oh, you know what? I'll go ahead and drop it
Yeah.
in the chat so that people have it." It's very fun. So
Yeah.
this is something that you wrote specifically about implementing high contrast forced colors tweaks.
Exactly. And this is through the hook of CSS custom properties. We can get to that in a bit, but if you scroll down a little bit, there is a section on support. And this is a kind of an important preamble before we get into this. So if we go to write these media queries, there is Windows high contrast mode, which only Internet Explorer knows about. So it doesn't work in Chrome, it doesn't work in Firefox, it doesn't work in Safari. Broadly speaking, under the hood, they do have some concessions for it, but for the purposes of this conversation and like functionally usable, they don't support it. Edge right now is the only browser right now that fully supports forced color mode properties, by which I mean only on Windows, where you can look at different colored themes. The cool part is that the forced color mode media query is cross-browser now, so we no longer have to use a vendor prefix for Windows high contrast mode. We now use forced colors mode. So this is to say that only IE and Edge will ever support Windows high contrast mode queries, but going forward, the new standard is forced contrast mode, and any browser that participates in web standards will honor it either soon or already does, which is really cool. The other thing that I'd kind of like to mention here is IE11 might be dead by way of Microsoft discontinuing support, but the map is not the territory. And, you know, particularly through the lens of disability, people are highly reluctant to upgrade technology if they don't know the consequences of it. They may not have the money to be able to afford a new device. On top of that, like some people are just locked out, like at your job, if you're using IE11 because somebody wrote an intranet app, you know, in 2004, and you've been using it ever since, and it's mission critical, and no way in heck are we gonna update. Like those circumstances happen, and there's people at the end of it, and it's important to remember that. And so, you know, for my day job, we are doing some forced color mode work. And because of that, we take an IE support first approach mentality, because we work on some government services that are that deal with healthcare. And you know, survivor bias is really real if somebody uses IE to get healthcare and they have high contrast mode activated. Like that's fine, that's great, and I'm happy to help serve them in that way. Whereas they may not have Edge. Fortunately, Edge is backwards compatible, so anything you write for high contrast mode is also Edge compatible. But it is a technical consideration, and I think it's an important one.
Absolutely. Um, yeah. All right. Uh,
So all that being said, if you do want to write a media query, I'm going to paste two of them in the chat, and then we can kind of talk about the keywords. Does
Yeah,
that
and
sound?
I'll pull up. I actually did find a previous version of my site. I'll go ahead and just pull up the editor for that, so we have a place to put this.
Great.
Um, Also, something in my system is chugging. My computer's chugging today. Some streams it
I
decides to chug, and some streams it's just totally fine. You can tell what the factor is there.
Yeah, the internet gods are grumbly today.
Mm, like this is my glorious editor for today. Um, Not a good sign. Yeah. So I guess uh, in that case, what I'm gonna do is put the Zoom chat up on the screen so we can see the two media queries while that comes up. So there's two I see here. There's actually there's three.
Mhm.
There's at media screen and MS high contrast active, and then at media screen and forced colors active. So this first one here, this is you were saying the vendor prefix for the legacy high contrast mode.
Exactly.
Um,
The dash MS is Microsoft's vendor prefix, and
yeah,
that targets any high contrast mode theme. There are two other companion media queries that only target black and white themes, but those are kind of way too purpose built and specific, in my opinion. So I don't
sure.
think they're worth considering.
Pop open a global SAS file that I've got here. We'll just start typing some of these things out.
Yeah,
Okay.
love you. Love your editor theme, by the way.
Thank you. This is it's called Night Mind. It's by Brent Morton, who's sometimes in the chat. I went with it because it's like a higher contrast theme, doesn't look like too washed out on stream. So it's a good one. I actually do I have a chat command that'll spit out the theme. Um
That's amazing.
yeah, God. Just once you start gig like into streaming and you start like tweaking like chat commands and stuff like that, so good. Okay.
Yeah.
So yeah. And high contrast. Div. Ooh, I can spell active. I can actually spell active. What has happened here? Oh. Really? VS Code, are you okay? What is that? Why would it? Okay.
Oh, yeah. Wild.
Gosh. I've not seen that before. Urf. Okay. Okay, there it is.
Yeah.
Fixed.
The
Wow.
joys the joys
The
of live
joy.
coding.
Yeah. No kidding. Okay, so then there was media screen and forced colors
Force
active.
dash colors. Yep.
Then finally there was one that combined both of them.
Hmm.
I'll get that. And this. All right, there we go. So these were the three media queries that you had given me. Hey Brent is in the chat. Hey Brent, good to see you.
Yeah, and just one little nitpick here. I apologize.
Yeah.
On line 41 with the and, you'll want to use a comma instead of and.
Oh, okay. So okay.
Yeah, and the reason for this is the previous selector you wrote would said you need both Microsoft Windows high contrast mode active as well as force colors mode active, which
Oh,
I don't think technically can happen, but this is saying either one of these is active.
gotcha. Okay. Okay, so yeah, all right. And then what goes into these queries? Like, do I just write CSS as normal or?
Yeah, sort of. So all the CSS properties that are available to us in non-forced colors mode are available to us in forced colors mode. We can honestly, if we can realistically probably just use forced color active that query just to kind of keep
Yep,
things streamlined. And remember, Edge has backwards compatible support.
makes sense. All right, so I'm in my media query.
Mhm. And so let's change the color of something. So maybe our H2s.
Yeah. All right, and
And
then I would do color and can I just specify whatever color I want in here?
so yes and no. And this is where the real magic happens. So you can type color red and CSS will honor that. Enforce colors mode will honor that. That's a perfectly valid declaration. The problem is what if that color red, you can't see it?
Hmm.
So what you can do instead when force color mode is actually tie into that operating system mapping stuff that we just showed you. So instead of red, there are keywords. So if you go back to the Smashing Magazine article, I can show you the breakdown of how these all map.
Okay.
So, and these correspond exactly to that theme picker that we were demoing earlier. So
Hmm.
regular inert static text is Canada's text, which is capitalized for C and T in Canvas and text, one word. Hyperlinks is link text. Disabled text is gray text. The foreground of selected text is highlight text. The background is highlight. Buttons is button text. Button background is button face, and backgrounds are canvas. And so these keywords will hook into the themes that you specify. So if we're using yellow for text, we write that keyword instead of the color yellow, and it ensures that it's adaptable. So if we ever change yellow to green for whatever reason, our CSS will update to match and our browser will update to match, which is very powerful.
Okay.
Uh,
So if I had decided, and I feel like this would be breaking conventions here, but if I decided that I wanted my headings to look like whatever the disabled color was, I could say gray text in here. Again, breaking convention here. This seems uh not not particularly semantic as it were, but I could say like gray text and it would pick whatever my disabled text color was, which back here I actually made pink. So in here, my disabled text. So my H2s would show up is as pink in this particular theme.
Precisely. Yeah.
Very cool. Okay.
So yeah, that's like, that's a very simplified example, but to your point you just said now, like force colors mode is all about predictability. So what you really want to do is find places where your content doesn't work and make little nudges and tweaks there. So like a really common example of this is like, say you have a card component that doesn't have a border on it, but the whole thing is clickable. Um, you know, uh, Again, like force colors mode does not care about your sense of aesthetics, so it'll throw out like a drop shadow that you're using to help convey its boundary. And one of the things you can do is add a border when force color mode is active, and that will take effect. And so now that you can understand the boundaries of the card better when the force color mode is active, and understand that it's like one concrete little thing and that you can click on it. And that's important to kind of mention because, again, like disability is a spectrum, it's not a binary. So, if you're using this, you might also be using screen magnification software. You might not have the larger context of the card if you've incredibly zoomed in on something. So just that's it's helpful to make these little tweaks to help communicate the purpose of the components that you're using. So
Yeah, and
here,
I
oh yeah,
actually So I have done this on my personal site, where I've got uh, you mentioned specifically the borders around cards. So
Mhm.
if we were to look at that like markup there, um, like here I'll pull this up. First of all, we can see the outline. We can see the outlines around here by um think that my computer speed is not helped by
Yeah.
uh porting to a virtual machine. But I've got this like this list item with a class card, and I think I have I do this the cover where I show the is some. Oh no, I think
I see. Yes. Okay. So you're
yeah.
actually being very clever with this too. Um, the transparent keyword. So in a normal mode, I hate that term. In a non-force color mode, uh, transparent means you can see through it, and then force color is all about making things obvious. So you have a 3 pixel transparent solid border in normal mode. And one of the things that high contrast mode and force color mode do is turn borders into visible borders. So now that this is active, it's saying, 3 pixels solid transparent, transparent ain't transparent no more. We're going to map that to whatever has been set for, I believe, our
Okay.
button button color, or no, sorry, our inert text color. And that's great because you're kind of designing defensively, because what that statement says is, when force color mode is not active, there's an invisible outline, and that preempts somebody potentially having force color mode active. So if it does, show that border, and that saves you the headache of having to write a media query to kind of fix it in
Mm,
post, which is less, net less code sent down the wire and net less code to maintain.
okay. But if I had wanted to do this with media queries, I could be saying that this was like I could do my card class and then border 3 pixel solid canvas text, assuming I didn't have like the transparent outline. This is another way I could have gone about it.
Yep, precisely.
Okay.
And then if you really wanted to like hammer home that the whole card was clickable, you could even use your hyperlink color instead, and that borrows on that visual affordance that says like all links have this color. This color is a destination. I mash it, I will go to a place.
Gotcha. Makes a lot of sense. Cool. So is that really the meat then of like working with forced colors mode is kind of going in and finding places where it's like we could map something to one of those like semantic forced color names. Just applying it there, or is there more to do with forced colors mode?
Yeah, yeah. That's the bulk of it. And like also that's kind of the point. Um, and a good way to also think about this is like, one of the things you can do with CSS is write specificity hacks to overcome uh, stuff you can't control. So like you have a website, the website has an iframe, the iframe has content that comes from a third-party vendor. You can't really talk to that vendor, but you can use nasty CSS hacks to fix stuff if it's broken um, on your site that you show their code. The same way, realistically, you don't always have control over the markup that your site generates. And that's one of the reasons I'm super into design systems, because I do get to help inform those choices. But there are going to be circumstances where you're going to have a button that's written with a div and there's nothing you can do about it. And that stinks and I don't like
Hmm.
it. It's inaccessible, but you can write high contrast mode keywords to get around that. And the reason I say a div, because it happens all the time, but also another really important thing to know about force color mode and high contrast mode is if you take that div and you put some ARIA on it to make it clickable, and the tab index and like all that good stuff, wire it up exactly the way it's supposed to, force colors mode and Windows high contrast mode still don't understand ARIA. They only understand semantic HTML.
Mm.
So, you're going to have to write this media query to kind of get around that. Otherwise, it may not look interactive, which means people might not know to click it.
Yeah, that's a really great call out. So by leveraging semantics, not only are we getting the like functionality out of the box that browsers have supplied, but like we're indicating in alternate viewing modes like high contrast mode, forced colors mode, that like it should leverage those same semantics and therefore those semantic colors. Interesting to think about this in terms of like semantic colors too. That is a fun mental model, I think.
Yeah, and I think it's kind of the direction the web's generally headed to, which makes me really happy because like most people are familiar with light and dark mode themes, and that's all about like saying with certainty, like this is a button on a light background, and like when this mode is active, it's this, and when this mode is
Mhm.
active, it's that. And like I think we're getting a lot more purposeful about this kind of stuff. So I feel this is kind of a logical extension of that kind of thinking. Um, the other thing for developing and designing with this is you want to make tiny little surgical tweaks. You don't want to completely overhaul stuff.
Mhm.
If your designer is like, oh, we have to create a force colored mode experience, you probably want to tell them to tone it down, buddy, because this predictability, this
Mhm.
very intentional like boosting of contrast and legibility is the point. So what you want to look for instead is areas where either your content doesn't hold up.
Mhm.
If we go back to Wikipedia, I can actually point out another thing that I noticed.
Yes. Any particular article like the?
Just whichever article we have, or any article.
Yeah, I'll go back to the assistive technology one. Here we go.
Beautiful. So the top and left and right borders on the read tab, for example, are currently not visible.
Hmm.
And that's important because that'll help communicate that they're tabs and that this one's currently active. Like what we have here is kind of okay, but we could, honor the design across different modes. So that's like an example of the little tweaks I'm talking about. The other thing is like if you have subtle designs, for example, like a modal with that uses a drop shadow instead of a border, um, you might not know that that's a modal in a low vision context. So when force color mode is active, given it a big chunky border to help communicate foreground and background. I think I have an example of that in the Smashing Magazine article.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, I'm just gonna Google it within here. So Smashing Magazine, and I'm just gonna put high contrast, and we'll see how good Smashing's search engine optimization is.
Yeah,
Sure, it's pretty good. Uh,
one would hope.
that it? I think that's it. March
Yep,
2022. Yeah,
that's our boy.
it's our boy. And okay, so there's a modal somewhere in here.
Mhm. And I believe it's down towards the bottom in a code pen.
Love the hot dog stand theme.
Thank you. I'm so glad you got it.
It's atrocious. And it's cursed.
Yep.
But I have much love for it anyways.
I
Um,
couldn't resist throwing in hot dog stand into a very serious publication. Yeah, so
hopefully
here's
skipped right past
here's
this.
a great example.
Up. Once the there we go, it's scrolling back up again. Aha, aha. Okay. Big chonky
Yeah,
border.
big chunky border. We now know that there's a thing floating on top of another thing, which is a great example. Another kind of thing I like to do is like if you have things that are bumped inwards to represent hierarchical nesting. So like like tabs, side tabs, and stuff like that. bump them just a tiny bit more. Sometimes a thicker underline. If you use ghost buttons, which have a very thin border, fill it and flip it instead to make it look more apparent as a button,
Mm,
especially if, considering there might be somebody who's zoomed in real close or is using a physical magnifying glass, like just really reinforce the material honesty of what you're looking at. Like make a button look like a button, make a link look like a link, make a modal very obvious that it's floating over content, that kind of stuff.
absolutely. Awesome. Um, cool. Chat, do y'all have any questions for Eric? Anything y'all want to know? In the meantime, a question I have is, have you found any like gray areas with tweaks where it's like, well, we could tweak, but we're uncertain of if that would be like the right thing. Like, I'm trying to figure out like where those boundaries might be.
Yeah. So a really interesting one we were contending with is US government websites have a little banner with a flag on it, and the flag is an SVG, and the flag indicates that helps indicate that like this is a official US government website. And so we had a very interesting conversation where it was like, should the flag update or shouldn't it? Like, is it an image or is it more important that it's like you can see the flag in a potential low vision scenario? We were still debating that one, so I don't have a good
Hmm.
answer for you. Um, but like that's kind of an example of something we've grappled with of a gray area. The other thing is sometimes when you have really exotic designs, there may not be a good analog for what something maps back to. So you kind of have to play philosopher and be like, this ridiculous interaction that somebody cobbled together, is that more like a button or a link? Like,
Hmm.
like it's not disabled, but it's not interactable right now, but it's also like nothing I've really ever encountered before. So like, what does that map to? Like, what is it? What's at its core? What is it really trying to communicate?
Makes sense. Um, Yeah, so far there's no questions from the chat, though Joe, Nasty Director, says, didn't think about how it would differ between semantics and arias. That's good to know. So, uh, yeah, I think a big takeaway here, I guess, is honestly just the importance of like regularly testing your stuff with like real assistive technologies. Like, because you have a sense for how your experience is supposed to behave and what stuff is important. And I think just sometimes going to your site with force colors mode active just clearly indicates like, oh, this thing has just become unusable.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, for the Aria thing, I was like shocked that it
Mm.
didn't support it. I kind of exactly to your point, I had that assumption that like, well, we just told it using code that it should be a button, so therefore it's a button. And then, one day I was looking at it for some client work, and then it was like, okay. Is it just this one piece of Aria? No, no, it's all of Aria. Okay. Like another vote in favor of semantic HTML, I guess.
Always, always. Um, Yeah, actually, even looking at like smashing here, like I know that this is supposed to be a little like pop up that like follows you down the page. Like even that, I'm looking at that going like that could probably stand to have an outline as well.
Yeah, yeah, and like, I mean, you know, sorry, Smashing Magazine folks, if you're watching, but like, maybe let's try bumping the screen to like 400% and see what happens to it.
Yeah, let's do it. Um, we can go further. There we go. Um,
Yeah.
Oh, that's lovely. Also, I would probably recommend making both of these links like quote link text color so that like it's clear that they are hyperlinks. That or
Yep.
button. Like I don't at a certain point I imagine it would be kind of fine to pick one or the other. But like just
Yeah.
to indicate
Yeah.
it's clickable in the first place in force colors mode.
Yeah. But like, and I agree. And also like the real MVP here would be like a little border to help disambiguate the difference between the cookie modal and the content behind it. And
Yeah.
like people might be rolling their eyes and being like, 400%, who does that? Like a lot of people do. Like this is the web
Oh yeah.
for for a non-trivial amount of people. And more importantly, like I shouldn't have to quantify it with numbers. Like if this is what somebody needs to,
Mhm.
pay their taxes